What makes Clayfighter Sculptor's Cut a $15,000 game? Well, we're gonna be figuring that out in this video. Now, just to be clear, this is a remake of a video that I made 10 years ago, but I'm hoping that we can add more to it than just production value. So once we talk about the history and the rarity of the Clayfighter franchise and Sculptor's Cut here, I'm also going to be playing the game, giving you guys a mini review and my thoughts on it. So for now, let's talk about Clayfighter as a franchise.
Are you ready? Meet Mr. Frosty, snowman with an attitude, Clayfighter for life. Fists and feet fly as bad Mr. Frosty and his Clayfighter friends smack it out in hilarious head-to-head combat in Interplay's 1 or 2 player action game, Clayfighter.
The Clayfighter franchise started all the way back in 1993 with the first Clayfighter game being released for the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis. Developed and published by Interplay, they would go on to also release Clayfighter 2 for the Super Nintendo and another Clayfighter game called Clayfighter Tournament Edition, which is said to maybe have also been a rental exclusive, but it's nowhere near as expensive as Sculptor's Cut. And then of course they released Clayfighter 63 1/3 on the Nintendo 64, followed by the final release in the Clayfighter franchise, Clayfighter Sculptor's Cut in 1998. Now, there were a couple other games after this point that were in development but got canceled, including a PlayStation 1 version of Clayfighter, a couple downloadable ones for the Wii shop and the DS shop, and then a PC version all the way in 2016, but unfortunately, those have never seen the light of day. Now, Interplay did also release another game on Super Nintendo called Claymates, which is in their kind of claymation like franchise, but it's kind of like a spin-off of Clayfighter. It's not directly related, but it does have the same claymation style graphics, but it's a completely different gameplay and just completely different game altogether. It's kind of related, but not really. So what makes Clayfighter unique as a franchise is that they actually used physical clay models of these characters, which they would then animate for the games. There are games like Mortal Kombat, which back in the day, it was pretty revolutionary to use actual human actors, which was then animated into the game. But to use clay models, I think is pretty unique. I'm not saying that there's no other games that have done that, but as far as I know, nothing that spawned a franchise kind of like Clayfighter. So I think it's very unique, and although the games aren't really remembered super fondly, I think that at least the Nintendo 64 versions, which I have played before, are pretty fun, but that may just be me wearing nostalgia glasses because I had Sculptor's Cut when I was a kid. But that leads into Sculptor's Cut itself. I actually owned Sculptor's Cut when I was a kid. I got it as a Christmas gift from my grandfather, who used to live up around Seattle in a place called Vashon Island. There was a Blockbuster on the island there, and that's where he got the game. And this must have been when, you know, Blockbuster was getting rid of stuff. And I remember opening it on Christmas morning and of course being excited because as a kid, and like most kids who don't have a game room like this, I only had a handful of games. And so I may have some nostalgia with it, and I did enjoy this game when I was a kid. And after playing it right now, I can say confidently that it's not a bad game. It's also not a great game though. The two things that I like the most about the game will be the sound effects and music, and then also just the look and the wacky characters. The backgrounds and stuff, for the most part, are a little plain, although I do enjoy that in some of the different levels, if you get hit in the right direction or area, you can kind of like enter a new part of the ring, which is kind of cool. You'll see that in the gameplay a little bit, but the wacky characters and the sound effects are probably the best part of the game. The music I think is pretty good as well. It fits the kind of just like ridiculous theme of everything. And it's not a bad game, like I said. It's just your standard kind of, you know, fighting game, similar to Mortal Kombat, Street Fighter, Soul Calibur, Tekken, anything like that. I do think that Clayfighter Sculptor's Cut has much more of this like humorous, weird, wacky, creative type feel to it, which is pretty cool because I feel like most fighting games, whether you're talking about Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter or Tekken, they have a more realistic approach. And while most people would look at an original Mortal Kombat game and say, this is not realistic at all, compared to Sculptor's Cut, it definitely is. I also really enjoy that when characters get hit, you have like body parts or little objects that will fly out of you that they don't do anything, it's just a visual effect. But I think it's kind of funny when you're playing as a character like Taffy, who is basically this big piece of candy. You get hit and things like lollipops and stuff will fly out of your character. When you're playing as, you know, one of the human characters, like a brain will fly out or a bone or something like that. And I think that those little touches of just like creativity and wackiness really add to the fun of the game, because overall it's pretty mediocre, but there are some cool things about it. So why is this game so rare and expensive? So I mentioned at the beginning of the video that this game is worth $15,000, and while most copies do not sell for that based on condition, there was a private sale that was confirmed earlier January of 2024 that sold for $15,100. Now, if you look on pricecharting.com, typically they take the average and that's what it tells you a game is worth, but if you actually click underneath the listings there, it'll show you all of the sold listings. Most of these usually come from eBay, but price charting will also take into account private sales and sales made directly on price charting. The only way to really get one of your private sales onto price charting is to contact someone that works for price charting, usually the owner, JJ, and provide him proof that the game actually sold. I have done this plenty of times for games we sell at our store that are a little bit more expensive or rare. If you scroll down on the Sculptor's Cut listing, you'll actually see a private sale of, I believe it was like $7,400 or $7,800. That was our copy that we sold at the Portland Retro Gaming Expo. So the confirmed sale of $15,100 is a legit sale. Now you can also see that that one says mint in the title, so it was probably an extremely good condition copy, which is why it sold for that much. But going back only 4 years, there are 4 copies that have sold for over $10,000. So 15 isn't that much of a stretch when you take those other sales into account. I will say though, there are copies that have sold much, much lower, but it all just depends on condition, right? And especially condition of the instruction manual, which is the hardest piece to find for this game. Like I mentioned earlier, Clayfighter Sculptor's Cut was released in 1998, but it was a Blockbuster exclusive, meaning that you couldn't just go to the store and purchase a copy of this game. It was only available for rental when it first came out. So the only way that these games got into collectors' hands is when Blockbuster was changing over their inventory, moving from Nintendo 64 and PS1 to the GameCube, original Xbox, Sega Dreamcast, and PS2 era. They would normally go through and sell their older games, and that's how some of these copies of Sculptor's Cut got out into the public and got into collectors' hands. Now, the reason why the manual itself is so rare is because if you remember shopping at a place like Blockbuster, I'm sure Hollywood Video and other rental stores would do the same thing. When you rented that game, typically you were just taking the cartridge home. You weren't taking the entire box and the manual. Sometimes you would, depending on the store, but most of the times you just got the game. So a lot of times when Blockbuster would get these games in the mail, they were brand new, but they would have to open them to, to rent them out. Sometimes they would immediately just throw away the manual. They would just get rid of it because usually they either just get destroyed or they get stolen. So some stores would keep them, but a lot of them would just toss them or maybe put them in storage or something like that. The boxes sometimes would be put out on the shelf, which of course they get really beat up over, people grabbing them and touching them all the time. Sometimes they would cut the boxes and put them into like a plastic holder, which obviously destroys it. And then sometimes they would just throw the boxes away as well. So while these days a cartridge is still pretty rare and can sell for like $900 to $1,000, the box and manual is where the real money is, and especially in that instruction manual, because like I said, a lot of them just got destroyed or thrown out. Since I've been a hardcore video game collector going back to about 2008, and I've also owned my own retro video game store since 2018, I have had the unique opportunity to have owned 3 complete copies of Sculptor's Cut in my lifetime, which is something that most people don't get the chance to do. I actually made a video back on the channel a while ago comparing my friend Sam's collection to my collection when I purchased it from him, and I was going through and swapping out stuff and keeping the better condition copies of all these Nintendo 64 games, and in that video I was able to compare 2 complete copies of Sculptor's Cut side by side, which is something that I'll probably never have the chance to do ever again. Super, super rare games, and it was very fun to do that. If you want to check that out, you can go back on the channel and watch it. So it seems like Interplay doesn't really release new games these days, but I think that it would be really cool if we had an updated version of Clayfighter, whether that is a new game in the franchise or maybe even just a remake, but for current gen consoles, specifically the Nintendo Switch. We have had lots of other game franchises that have been resurrected that were popular in the late 80s up through the mid 90s. Stuff like Pocky and Rocky and Snow Brothers, those both got new releases over the last few years, and I think Clayfighter would be a good addition to that. And these games aren't gonna sell millions and millions of copies, of course. They're not like AAA titles or anything like that. But for the people, for the older gamers who remember it, and then to hopefully get some new interest from players now, I think it would be cool if there was some sort of updated version, at least for Nintendo Switch, if not released on all the consoles. And I think Clayfighter is a big enough franchise that was popular enough back when it was around that there are still people who would remember it fondly and pick up a new entry in the series today. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Would you buy a new Clayfighter game if one came out for the Nintendo Switch? Especially if it was like 30 bucks brand new? I know that I would. So let me know what you guys think. Thank you so much for watching this video. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you found something entertaining here. And I want to thank you guys again for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll see you guys in the next one.